A surprise U.S. military deployment is on its way to the coasts of Venezuela. Here's what you need to know. There are 3 U.S. Navy destroyers, attack aircraft, and at least some 4,000 Marines involved in this deployment. Officially, their mission is to combat drug trafficking from South America to the U.S., but they're also putting embattled Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro on notice. For years, the U.S. has said that Maduro is involved in drug trafficking, that his government is part of a cartel that sends tons of cocaine to the U.S. The Trump administration in August doubled a reward to $50 million on Maduro's head. Maduro denies these allegations, but he's also not backing down. He's putting soldiers, some 4 million of them, onto the street to defend against any possible U.S. invasion. Well, that's unlikely to happen. U.S.-Venezuelan tensions are as high point as they have been in years.
History repeats itself. Every time the U.S. sails its warships into Latin America, it comes disguised as a mission of peace, but ends up as a move for regime change. Today, that same script is playing out off the coast of Venezuela, where Washington has sent 3 Arleigh Burke destroyers, USS Gravely, USS Jason Dunham, and USS Sampson, billion-dollar machines designed for full-scale war, now just chasing cartels. Before the ships even arrived, the U.S. had already placed a $50 million bounty on President Nicolas Maduro, branding him a narco-terrorist. And soon after, it launched this so-called counter-narcotics mission, a justification many see as a cover for pressuring his government. Maduro struck back with his own show of strength, claiming to activate 4.5 million militia reserves, painting the U.S. deployment as an imperialist invasion. And now, with warships on one side and mass mobilization on the other, the world is watching to see if this becomes another chapter of gunboat diplomacy.
I really don't like how people can look at America going to Venezuela and be like, yeah, they're definitely doing it because of the oil reserves they have, not any good intentions. And people will take that as, oh, you're for the authoritarian government in Venezuela? No! It's just that I'm not going to believe the U.S. is going in there to overthrow an authoritarian government. That's not what they're there for. They're not going in there with the good intentions of we need to free Venezuela and get them a democracy. No! They're there for the oil supply. They want a regime that they can get a fuck ton of oil out of for cheap. It's the same thing as Iraq and Iran. They don't care about democracy. They care about having somebody in there who will give them the resources they want. It's the same thing for like Vietnam and Korea, where instead of resources, they just wanted a foothold in there. It wasn't for democracy. It wasn't to stop communism. It was so that they had somewhere in Asia that they could launch offensives against China. Why do you think we want Taiwan so bad? It's not just because of the computer chips. It's because it's a great staging ground if we need to attack China.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says his government is deploying 4.5 million soldiers across Venezuela after the United States said it would be shipping more than 4,000 Marines and materiel to the Caribbean region. This comes after the Trump administration secretly signed a directive approving the Pentagon's use of military force supposedly to target Latin American drug cartels. The Trump administration's accused Maduro of being the leader of the Cartel de los Soles, offering up to a $50 million reward for information leading to Maduro's arrest, which critics have slammed as another attempt by the United States to destabilize Venezuela and other countries that oppose U.S. policy.
Es muy grande la causa que defendemos, así que el cambio de régimen, además de ilegal, es inmoral. Y aquí no lograrán ni colonizar, ni esclavizar, ni a Venezuela, ni a América del Sur, ni a nuestra América. Y si algún día tocan a Venezuela, toda la América se levantará por nosotros, por el pueblo de Bolívar.
Did you know that World War III already started? Forget about Russia and Ukraine. Forget about Gaza and Israel. Well, not really, but you know what I mean. And let's talk about the lady on the main stage, Venezuela. So after 10 minutes of research, I started to find a pattern. A pattern of infrastructure being invested into, or straight up being built into the country of Venezuela, which include Chinese housing projects, Chinese hospital projects, Russian oil projects, okay, just to name a few. Not to mention Huawei already setting up shop in Venezuela and Mexico, but we'll get to that later. So what does this mean for this region? That it just became very unstable. And this region is very important to the shipping economy. Why? Because of Panama, which is home to the Panama Canal. Try to keep up here. So how do we know that stuff's going to go down? Well, Mexico decided to build their own Panama Canal, only on land, which is going to be somewhere in the Oaxaca region, which proves that a strategic retreat is in place and infrastructure is getting placed closer to home so we spend less on logistics. Like this video and follow me, and I'll make a part 2 showing everybody what the cartels have to do with all of this going on right now.
As the United States plans possible military action against Venezuela, China is moving to strengthen its position in the country's energy sector. According to reports, Beijing is investing more than $1 billion into 2 Venezuelan oil fields, with the goal of producing around 60,000 barrels per day by late 2026. China already buys about 90% of Venezuela's crude exports, and this new move further embeds Beijing in Venezuela's oil industry. Analysts say it is turning President Nicolas Maduro's oil sector into a de facto Chinese outpost. The United States has long tried to weaken Maduro's government through sanctions and restrictions on Venezuela's oil trade. But rather than isolating Caracas, the measures have pushed Venezuela closer to Beijing, deepening China's role as the country's main economic lifeline. The developments highlight the growing geopolitical competition in Latin America, where Venezuela's vast oil reserves remain a central prize. The clash over Venezuela's oil is no longer just about energy. It's about power, influence, and the battle lines of a new global order.
Venezuela and Russia just signed an alliance agreement, but what does this actually mean for the United States? First, it puts Russian influence right in America's backyard. For decades, Washington has treated Latin America as its sphere of influence. Now, with Moscow teaming up with Caracas, that dominance is being directly challenged. Remember, Venezuela is only about 1,300 miles from Miami. That's closer than New York is to Dallas. If Russia starts stationing assets there, it changes the security map overnight. Second, it's about energy and money. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves. With Russia under Western sanctions, both countries could work together to build a shadow energy market, cutting the US and Europe out. Third, it complicates America's military posture. The US already has troops and warships in the region, claiming to fight cartels. But with Russia involved, every move risks escalation. And finally, it's symbolic. Moscow is saying, if you squeeze us in Ukraine, we'll squeeze you in your own hemisphere. It's Cold War logic, revived in 2025. So for the US, this alliance isn't just about Venezuela, it's about facing a world where rivals like Russia and even China are challenging its power on multiple fronts at the same time.
Donald Trump sent 6 warships and 1 submarine off the coast of Venezuela this morning. What's that about? Well, he doesn't rule out a boots-on-the-ground invasion of the vast territory of Venezuela with its government, which, let me put it this way, would be itching for a fight with the 4,000 U.S. Marines that Donald Trump has on board these warships. He hasn't ruled out, Donald Trump, a landing, boots-on-the-ground invasion. All in the interests of fighting the drug cartels, of course. Nothing to do with the fact that Venezuela is the world's largest oil-producing country, and that Venezuelan oil is perfectly suited to the American refinery market. Nothing to do with creating yet another war when the wars he's already deeply involved and implicated in are, despite his repeated protestations, not yet resolved.
Agreed to have elections. The elections were completely fake. They leveraged migration against us to get those concessions, and now they have these general licenses where companies like Chevron are actually providing billions of dollars of money into the regime's coffers, and the regime kept none of the promises that they made. So all that needs to be re-explored, because in Venezuela, you have the Russian presence, you have a very strong Iranian presence. The Iranians, in fact, are exploring, or in fact are beginning to build drone factories for the manufacture of Iranian drones in our own hemisphere. Not to mention the long practice of the Venezuelan regime of providing real but illegitimate passports to operatives for Hezbollah in our own hemisphere. And lastly, and I leave it lastly to Cuba.
中方反对任何违反联合国宪章宗旨和原则、侵犯别国主权安全的行为。我们反对在国际关系中使用或威胁使用武力，反对外部势力以任何借口干涉委内瑞拉内政。希望美方多做有利于拉美和加勒比地区和平与安全的事情。
He convocado para el próximo sábado y el próximo domingo en las sedes de cuarteles militares, unidades militares plazas públicas centrales, plazas Bolívar, y en las sedes de las bases populares de defensa integral, de las 15.751 bases populares de defensa integral, a un proceso de alistamiento nacional de todas las fuerzas milicianas, de toda la milicia nacional bolivariana.
So Maduro, the president of Venezuela, is probably throwing a hissy fit today. Trump just revoked his licenses that were given to Chevron to dig for oil in that country. This is how he got the majority of his money that puts him in that big old palace that he lives in. For those of you who are not aware, there was recently an election there. He's been the president there for a long time. It didn't look like it was going real good for him. He just stopped the election. He said, I'm just going to stay in power. So Americans, or the presidency, the administration, they don't view him as the actual leader of that country. And this is taking a step to say, you can no longer dig for oil. They even have his plane. They took his plane that was in the Dominican, and it's being held there by the Americans because, again, they don't believe that he won that election legally. It was more like he just decided to stay in power. So this is an attempt to cut him off completely.
Tension is rising within the Caribbean. The U.S. Navy is moving in, and Venezuela is mobilizing troops. And now, threats against Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago are made from the Venezuelan Minister of Defense. What does this mean for the Caribbean nation as a whole? And what does this mean for us? The US has deployed warships into the Caribbean Sea as a means of pressuring Maduro, as they do not recognize his regime. They also accuse Maduro of facilitating the drug trade and being involved in narcotics trafficking into the states, causing the drug pandemic. Meanwhile, Maduro is mobilizing militias and making threats towards Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana. Why, you may ask? Maybe it's oil, resources, power. So what does this mean for the Caribbean? Well, if things escalate, small islands can get caught in the middle between a US-Venezuelan showdown. Things like trade, fuel prices, food imports, and even tourism can take a major hit. And with Venezuela already being in crisis, instability can spew over to our shores. The big question is, do Caribbean leaders have a plan? Or are we just sitting, waiting, while superpowers play chess with our future? What do you think? So the Honorable Kamala Persad-Bissessar just threw her support behind the US sending warships in Venezuela to fight the drug cartels. But here's a twist. Our own Foreign Affairs Minister already said that Trinidad and Tobago will not be involved. So now, you have the Prime Minister backing US action against Venezuela, while our Foreign Affairs Minister is trying to distance TNT. This can create mixed signals on where we stand on international affairs. However, the Prime Minister's move to stand firm with its ally, the US, is one of resilience, showing that Trinidad and Tobago will not tolerate drug trafficking and cartels entering its water or facilitate the drug trafficking trade. It is one that shows that the Prime Minister stands with a zero tolerance for criminal activities. So why does this matter to Trinidad and Tobago? Well, we currently share a border with Venezuela, as seen here. We're already dealing with migration issues, security risk, and regional trade. Any US and Venezuelan tensions can spill over to our waters and even in our economies. On one hand, backing US action can further strengthen our alliances, boosting cooperation on drug trafficking, and probably bettering trade relations, investments, and maybe lowering tariffs. On the flip side, it risks straining our relationship with Venezuela, our literal neighbor. We already share oil and gas deals with Venezuela, and it can make us a target for any regional tensions. The Prime Minister has made it clear that should Venezuela invade Guyanese territory, Trinidad and Tobago will open up its waters to US naval forces and cooperate. So the bigger question to ask is whether the Prime Minister is right or wrong. That depends on how you look at it. Support for the US could mean stronger international backing, but it could also put TNT in the middle of a conflict that we are trying to avoid. This debate isn't only about politics. It's about our security, our economy, and our foreign affairs. So what do you think? Should TNT stand with the US stay neutral, or only look out for ourselves? The Caribbean believes in peace, but peace without defense is weakness. With tensions rising between the USA and Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana finds itself caught in the middle between a bigger game of chess with us just being pawns. Yes, the US may come to protect our sovereignty, however that is not guaranteed. But the bigger question is, are we ready and able to protect our own sovereignty? Our regiment is strong in spirit and skilled, but underfunded and under-equipped. If conflict reaches the region and chaos spills into our shores, do we have what it takes to protect our sovereignty? And how do we safeguard CARICOM brothers and sisters who may look at us for leadership? We may want to stand neutral, but if push comes to shove, we may be forced to pick a side. Whether you like it or not, Trinidad and Tobago is one of the leading nations within CARICOM, and as such, due to treaties that have been signed in the past, we may be called on to respond should conflicts spew over to Guyana. Furthermore, Venezuela is literally a stone throw away from Trinidad. Now some may ask where will we get the money from? But let's be real, we find billions for failed projects, corruption, and foreign consultants. Isn't protecting our people more important? Now, no one likes war. War makes no sense. However, with the world in turmoil, chaos is seamlessly finding its way closer and closer to our beautiful region. A strong defense isn't about war, it's about being prepared. We don't need nuclear weapons, we don't need battleships. We need smarter tools, drones, radar surveillance, cyber defense, and modern weaponry. A defense force designed for island security and not foreign wars. Our threats are real, with narco-trafficking, border breaches, illegal fishing, and piracy. Add in a natural disaster, and you'll see just how vulnerable we are. The Caribbean is a zone of peace, but peace is not guaranteed. Peace must be protected. And as the world grows more chaotic, it is time for Trinidad and Tobago to invest in its regiment, not just to secure our borders, but to be ready, not just for ourselves, but also our CARICOM family. We are surrounded by global powers, and we must always be ready to protect our sovereignty. I urge you to read up on geopolitics, as well as the security dilemma. Please, state your opinion, and let's have a conversation.
So Russian media Rybar is floating the idea of supplying long-range strike drones to Venezuela to attack the United States and our military assets in the region. They said, quote, "The increase in U.S. military activity in the Caribbean raises the question, how could Venezuela respond in the event of a conflict? The answer may lie in Russia's recent UAV advancements. Imagine Venezuela receiving 2,000 Garan or Shahed-style long-range drones. With that number, Caracas could threaten U.S. bases across the Caribbean and potentially even targets on the U.S. mainland. Even though the United States has experience intercepting these drones, thousands would require a significant increase in defensive assets. The threat to U.S. air bases would no longer be hypothetical." And they actually run down a list by name of all of the U.S. military locations in the region that would be in range of these drone strikes. They say this may force Washington to reconsider the cost of military escalation in the region. Venezuela is already a major buyer of Russian weapons. Supplying it with Garans seems like a logical step. Other countries might follow suit, seeking a cheap and long-range strike option. Mind you, this is happening while the United States is not layering sanctions on Russia, even though we said we would, because we don't want to disrupt the possibility of peace talks. They're talking about sending long-range drones off our shore that would put U.S. military bases in range.
So I want to talk to you about this Telegram channel called Rybar, which is a prominent Russian military blogging and Telegram channel known for pro-Kremlin commentary on global conflicts, particularly in Ukraine, which was identified actually by the U.S. government as part of a Russian influence operation, with the State Department offering up to $10 million for information on the outlet and its employees as of October 2024. Anyway, this channel's got a pretty large following and analyzes military strategies and proposes hypothetical scenarios that are aligned with Russian interests. In a recent Telegram post, which was dated around August 24th of 2025, Rybar suggested that Russia could supply Venezuela with approximately 2,000 Gerin 2 drones, which is Russia's version of the Shahed drone, the one-way drones that you see impacting all over the place in Ukraine, as a means to deter potential U.S. military intervention in the region. Now, this proposal is coming out after the heightened tensions in the area surrounding Venezuela following the disputed elections there, the U.S. sanctions on the Maduro regime, the extremely high wanted bounty for anybody that could provide information to the State Department that could lead to Maduro's arrest, and reports of increased U.S. naval presence near Venezuelan waters, including a U.S. littoral combat ship LCS-21, which is operating in the area. Now, Rybar's post was trying to frame this drone delivery as a strategic counter to the perceived U.S. aggression in the Caribbean, postulating that how will the situation change if Russian German UAVs are delivered to Venezuela. And in this post that they put up, it shows a 2,000 kilometer radius around Venezuela, from Caracas, and then shows all these different U.S. bases that are located in the region that they would be able to potentially strike with those drones, basically showing that this could be a potential deterrent for anything involving Venezuela. Now, I've seen a couple different ways that people have reacted to this. I've seen pro-Russian outlets and analysts saying that this could be a potential moneymaker for the Russians, because the Russians could export these things in a mass amount to Venezuela the same way that the U.S. has been exporting mass amount of arms to Ukraine. And then some more pro-Western perspectives have been just dismissive of this as provocative rhetoric or propaganda, which is unlikely to happen due to logistical issues and challenges and risks of escalation. Not to mention that any Venezuelan strikes on any U.S. forces at all would invite an overwhelming U.S. retaliation that would be beyond measure. Now, just to be clear, there's been no evidence from Russians, actual authentic Russian sources, saying that this is anything that's even planned, and it may just be a way for that page to stir the pot with edgy graphics.
Here's what you need to know about the invasion of Venezuela by the United States. It's not going to happen. There's no reason to do it. Get that out of your head. For one, even though, yes, China is Venezuela's largest oil purchaser, the United States is Venezuela's largest trading partner. The reason for all this tension between Venezuela and the United States, it has nothing to do with fentanyl. It has nothing to do with gangs or cartels. That's just a cover. The real reason why the United States is threatening Venezuela is because of oil. But it's not Venezuela's. And I know everybody who doesn't know about oil loves to talk about how Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on the planet. And it's true. They have even more oil than Saudi Arabia. 303 billion barrels. Woo! But the problem for Venezuela is that their oil is crappy quality. It is heavy and it's sour, meaning that there is a limited range of uses for it as opposed to better quality oil like Saudi Arabia or even Russia and the United States, which can be light and sweet. In fact, it's not only just heavy, it's considered extra heavy. But another kicker is that it is very expensive to get out of the earth, as opposed to Saudi Arabia, where you can get some of the crude oil out with a shovel. So if it's not Venezuelan oil that America is angry over, whose is it? It's Guyana's, in the Essequibo region, that Venezuela is threatening to annex. Why? Because their oil is light and sweet, and it's very easy to get out of the earth, unlike Caracas. Over the past decade or so, it's been discovered that at least 20 billion barrels of high-grade oil are in the Essequibo region of Guyana, and America has contracts on that oil, obviously. And because Venezuela's leadership can't do anything to generate actual economic production, they're just trying to take land for free and raise their economy that way. Now, Brazil has given Venezuela warnings, and they have even put a lot of their troops along the Venezuelan-Guyana border, but our president decided to say, no, we're going to really scare the crap out of Venezuela, and we're going to send over military personnel just waiting at the coast, just to give Venezuela that little warning that, hey, you try anything and we'll have 4,000 Marines and a whole bunch of firepower that you don't know how to deal with, even with those 4.5 million troops that you could not possibly logistically place all on the Guyanese border. But what about China? They're gonna swoop in and save the day for Venezuela. Yeah, is that right? China's been dealing with Venezuela for well over 20 years. In fact, they've been purchasing and investing in Venezuelan oil since 2006. When I say investing in Venezuelan oil, I just mean making sure that the oil flows stay stable, but nothing major, nothing really infrastructure related. You don't believe me? Let's just look at some devastating stats about Venezuelita. Remember, Venezuela's main export is crude oil and crude oil derivatives, as you can see in this little export table. Oh, and would you look at that, the Venezuelans are producing 1 million barrels of crude oil a day, as opposed to 400,000 during COVID. Woo! Let's just zoom out, compare their daily production to how much they used to produce before 2015. They were producing almost 3 million barrels a day. At any given time, they at least had 70 oil rigs working in the country, and they were at least exporting, let's say, $25 billion a year. That's not so bad. And the main reason for all that oil wealth was because America built that infrastructure with our petroleum companies, and they had a nice and rising GDP year on year until, of course, they decided to fully nationalize and no longer cooperate with American interests. And take a look, since 2014, their GDP has dropped by almost 2/3, actually more. Now remember, China's been investing in Venezuela for over 20 years. Where does that show in Venezuela's economy? Maybe they slowed the complete crash of the Venezuelan oil economy, but that's all China did. And remember, America was heavily sanctioning Venezuela at that point. But where are America's opposing economies coming in to save the day? They didn't, because even Russia and China don't trust Venezuela with any major infrastructure investments. Remember the oil rig counts for Venezuela that I mentioned? Okay, they had at least 70 running when things were good. Now they have 2. Venezuela has 2 functional oil rigs now, at least according to the most recent data. Why didn't China or Russia invest in oil rigs for this country that apparently was so lucrative and potentially powerful? China has the Belt and Road Initiative. They have built ports, they build bridges and highways, and even if countries can't pay it back, China will continue to lend and build in these countries, but they will not do that to the extent of, let's say, Pakistan for Venezuela, just because China trusts the instability of Pakistan more than even Venezuela's. And don't get me wrong, China has loaned quite a bit, at least $60 billion to Venezuela. But again, it's just to buy the oil. And when it comes to China bucking America, when it comes to Venezuela, that's just not true. Because even this year, China stalled a lot of their oil imports from Venezuela just because our president threatened them with more sanctions. Now, I'll be one of the first people to say taco, 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 but the fact that China blinked first is surprising. And despite all of this, China only buys 500,000 barrels a day from Venezuela because they have a much cheaper source of oil right directly to their north, Russia. So I hate to burst anyone's bubble about Venezuela finally standing up to the United States or China making its first huge incursion into American interests with talking to Caracas. That's just not true. This is old news. I am the Geo Husar. I'm back from my vacation, and I will see you all on my live later tonight. Thanks for watching.